So a good introduction to teaching is going to start with a focus on outcomes-driven design and lesson planning. So for those of you who are not familiar with the backwards design model, I'm just going to give you a very brief orientation to it. Wiggins and Mattei are really kind of the key figures in this area, and what they talk about is that you want to design with the end in mind. So what that means is you start off by thinking about what are the desired results. And we frame those in what are called learning outcomes. So learning outcomes are really the way that we define what we want students to either know, think, or do at the end of the class. So as a result of being with us for however many weeks, we'll use a traditional semester-based model, for instance, 15 weeks. What would be different about students when they leave your course than when they start? So we start with that end product. The next step then is to think about, well, what kind of evidence might I be able to gather to find out whether or not students actually achieve those learning outcomes? So we want to think about some formal approaches where you might have a final exam, a project, a paper, things of that nature. But some of it also can be more informal. It may come through discussions that happen in class or online, through some other kinds of means as well. So the idea here is to think about, okay, what are my goals and how will I know whether or not those goals have been achieved? After you've done both of those two steps, then the next step is to then focus on what teaching method might be the best one. So if I'm trying to get to this place, what method or path is going to be the most beneficial one for students to travel in order to get to that final destination? Many folks start with the teaching methods and what am I going to do in my classroom, and that is not the right approach. So what Wiggins and Mattei really say is that is an important part of the process, but you first need to set the stage with learning outcomes and what kind of evidence you'll gather. So backwards design is really based on the learning versus the teaching. So it's a little bit of a paradigm shift. Instead of focusing on what you're going to do, you're focused more on what the students will be able to do, and then you craft and design your activities to help them achieve that. There are a couple of key taxonomies that I want to introduce you to in case you are not familiar with them. The first one is Bloom's taxonomy. And Bloom is kind of a key figure in the educational world. And what you can see here is his pyramid that really, very nicely visually captures his taxonomy. And what Bloom says is that there's different levels of knowing. So when you say you want students to know something, what level of knowing are you really asking for? At the bottom, you can see remembering. That's the lowest level. So we do need foundational knowledge in order to be able to climb up that pyramid, but we need to make sure that we are addressing, our learning outcomes are addressing a variety of cognitive levels within this taxonomy and not all focused on remembering. So for instance, we may need students to, recall some basic facts in order to then be able to do more sophisticated things, such as maybe apply that content to a different situation or a different problem. We also want them to engage in higher level things like evaluating or even analyzing, text or situations and determining what are the, kind of pros and cons of the situation, how do things compare. And at the top of the pyramid, you can see Bloom has creating. So he believes that that's kind of the highest level, is once you have all this foundational knowledge, you've engaged in this higher level cognitive activities of applying, analyzing, evaluating. At the end of the day, a product is really what should come out of all of that cognitive work that you've just done. So as we think about the learning outcomes, the first step in design, you're going to want to think about which level of knowing am I really going after in my class. So here's another model. This one is by Fink, and Fink's taxonomy is a little different. You can see visually it's a circle, which, one of the primary differences is it's not hierarchical like Bloom's. Bloom's is hierarchical. You start at the bottom and you move up his pyramid. Well, Fink views it a little bit differently. I will note that Fink's taxonomy was specifically designed for the college population and, kind of took on this more integrated approach really to design. And as you can see here with the different parts of the, taxonomy, about half of it looks similar to Bloom. You see that foundational knowledge, which kind of, kind of attaches to the remembering and understanding levels of Bloom. So we do see that that's still an important part of the taxonomy. And then higher level skills like applying and integrating those concepts. But then on the other side of the circle, you're going to see some very different areas. These are a little more affective. I do want to note that Bloom does have an entire different affective pyramid, but it seems like they get, that doesn't really get a whole lot of time in the educational, kind of world. Everyone really zooms in on his cognitive one. But Finks really puts front and center that these affective parts are a part of the overall design. So you can see here, are you trying to also help students be better students as they're learning that concept, whatever the topic of your course is about? Are you igniting a passion and that caring? That's kind of essential. And then he really believes in the human dimension. Learning is not a isolated kind of situation. We're very social beings. So how are we learning about ourselves and others in the context of the content we're learning? So you can see a couple of different models here. So I want to go back to this very important concept of learning outcomes, because it really drives everything else that we're going to do. So you really cannot talk about teaching methods until you've clearly articulated what your learning outcomes are, because we won't know which teaching method is best suited for your desired goal. So here you can see a learning outcome is a specific statement that clearly identifies what knowledge, skills, and attitudes you expect from your graduates of your program, students completing your course, or participating in your service. So it depends on which avenue you're talking about. For us, we're going to target in on the course level, and we need to identify what those are. What you'll usually see is most courses have approximately 3 to 5 kind of big outcomes, and then you might dive down more specifically into objectives. So for instance, in online classes and other classes, you might have the objective attached to each lesson, but you need to see how do they fit into the overall learning outcomes for the class. So let's just take a minute to think about an example here. So if we had this example, students will appreciate the importance of learning about outcomes-driven design. I'm going to ask you to take a moment to think about this. How would you assess this learning outcome? Remember, after you identify the learning outcome, you need to then figure out what evidence would work to kind of let us know whether that was achieved or not. So you have a couple of options here to think about. I'm going to give you just a few moments to make your kind of, decision yourself to decide what answer you believe in. Okay, so I'm going to just go over the response. I would say my response for this would be I'm not really sure, because I'm not sure what appreciate means. I don't know. It doesn't sound like remembering. It might be understanding. I don't really know. I mean, appreciate is so vague that it's hard for me to know what level of learning they are trying to address. So if I can't even figure that out, it's really tough for me to figure out how would I assess that. I don't know if a multiple choice test or a paper is going to do it. A paper might, but again, without really knowing exactly what that meant, it's tough for me to know. Here's another example. So students will be able to articulate the importance of learning about outcomes-driven design. How do you think you might assess this one? Well, I would say a paper probably would work pretty well for this. Again, that we're saying that they're going to be able to articulate the importance. So if they need to articulate something, it's really hard to do that on a multiple choice test. There's no articulating. They might be able to recognize something in a multiple choice test, but it seems like we're asking them to do something a little bit higher level here, and I think a paper would be better suited. Here's another example. Students will be able to determine if a learning outcome is effective. What level of Bloom do you think this one addresses? I'll give you a moment to think about it. And I would say that this is really evaluating, because in order to figure out whether the learning outcome is effective or not, you're going to need to weigh the pros and cons, look at the advantages and disadvantages, really probably compare it to some type of rubric, and that's pretty high level cognitive skill. So I'd say evaluating is probably the best answer for that one. Here's another one for you. Students will be able to develop a lesson plan for a lecture. Give you a moment to think about what your response might be to this one. So I'd say at this point we're asking them to create, because now they're using all the knowledge that they've gained and they're actually creating a product. In this case, it's a lesson plan. Okay, now we're going to look at Fink's model for a minute. So let's take a look at this example. Students will be able to engage in reflection to assess how well they're learning the course content and to make adjustments to their learning behaviors as needed. Okay, so let's see which kind of evidence do you think is going to help you determine whether or not that outcome was achieved. So I'd say a reflection journal is probably the best way to go in this particular case, because you want to see if they can engage in reflection. So again, a multiple choice test probably not the best choice for determining whether or not this outcome was achieved. All right, and here's another one. What level of Fink do you think this most aligns to? Here is the outcome. Students will be able to engage in reflection to assess how well they're learning the course content and to make adjustments to their learning behaviors as needed. So same learning outcome, but now I'm asking you to think about what level of Fink it's attached to. And I would say this is probably learning how to learn, so I think that's really probably the best fit for this one. Okay, so we just went through a couple of examples, and now the idea here is after you've identified your learning outcomes, you need to figure out what kind of evidence is going to help you determine whether or not the learning outcomes have been achieved. You can see here there's several different kinds of evidence-based approaches to use. You could use quizzes or tests, you could use presentations, you could use some kind of group project, you could use a more independent learning experience like writing a paper or preparing some kind of product, whether it's a lesson plan or something else of that nature. So you really want to spend some time thinking about the evidence after you determine all your learning outcomes. And then last but not least is when you'll focus on the teaching methods. And this is going to be the focus of the course, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time really talking about these different methods, but there are kind of probably two major camps that you can think about in terms of teaching methods. One is often called direct instruction or the lecture, and there's a variety of ways in which you can lecture. Obviously, there's the old school where you're going to stand behind the lectern and lecture, and that is not necessarily what I recommend. I'm kind of more of a fan of interactive lectures, and we'll talk about what that looks like when we get to the lecturing module. There's the flipped classroom model, which again we'll be talking about that later on in the semester as well. And the flipped classroom is where you tend to have your lectures online so that you can have more interactive activities during class. Another kind of variation of the lecture is a discussion-based model. So the lecture may kind of prompt the initial foundational knowledge and then prompt a further conversation where students get to dive deeper into the content through a discussion in class. There's also a lot of different group works or active learning approaches that you can use. One is called peer reciprocal teaching, and that's when obviously peers are working together, but in a way where they're actually teaching one another the content. And we'll talk about a couple different models, such as the jigsaw classroom and interteaching. Then we have the inquiry-based learning model. Inquiry-based is where you as the faculty member come up and craft an assignment or an activity for the students to do, so that they then are engaged in determining kind of what happens when, instead of you just providing that information to them. So it might be testing a hypothesis, it might be that they're engaged in some kind of research or other method. And again, you might provide the prompts for them, but they may also be kind of having free reign to determine what the issue is and then determine whether or not they can kind of solve that issue. You'd be more of a guide on the side with all these approaches rather than front and center in terms of the learning and teaching part of it. And then last but not least is experiential learning, and that's where we can get students out into the field doing co-ops, internships, service learning, lots of different kinds of ways where you're doing and you're engaged in activities, not just cognitively, but you're really physically getting involved as well. So we'll talk a lot more about these as it goes on, but I hope this provides you with a good introduction. Okay, take care.